I wanted to show you this graph because it's actually from Stephen Schneider, who of course is very central to this whole climate scam business. And it's a systems diagram of atmospheric processes, and it shows you how complicated the situation actually is. When you look at all of this, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 pieces that make up the complexity of what creates weather and climate, and they focused on CO2. Okay, so they pick one gas out of the whole thing and so virtually ignore everything else. Next slide. Here's the forcing diagram, and it doesn't matter if you can't read. You never read fine print in your life anyway, so why start now? But this is the forcing diagram of the IPCC. This is the 1995 report, and I mentioned to Tony, the 1990 report was not unreasonable. The real political influence came with the 1995 report. That's when they started to really control things. And you see here listed, there are 11 variables. And of course, those are just the human variables. And I described this as they got a 5,000 piece puzzle, and they say they've solved the puzzle with 11 pieces. Isn't that remarkable? Well done. And of course, one of the things, well, we go to the next slide. This is the same slide in the AR5 report, but what I want you to notice over here on this side, this column says LOSU, which is level of scientific understanding. There's 11 of them there, only 2 are high. All the rest are medium or low. So the 11 that you're looking at, you don't know much about. And that hasn't improved much here into the AR5. Okay. Just very quickly, of course, the focus on CO2. This is the total atmosphere. That's the greenhouse gases in yellow. Here it's expanded to 100%. This is the CO2, the 4% of natural CO2, and that's the portion of it that's the human portion. So you start to get an idea of the scale or the dimension of what we're looking at here. And we can see it on the next graph in a more dramatic way. Here you can see CO2, methane, and of course the 95% that's water vapor. What they've done from the start, you say, well, humans produce water vapor, but the amount we produce is so small relative to the total amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, we just ignore it. But the gentleman here mentioned that it varies from 1 to 4%, and in fact, you've only got to vary water vapor in the atmosphere by 1%. It equals all of the effects of CO2. But you've already taken that out of the equation when you're looking at this particular graph. Okay, so we got a hypothesis. They created a hypothesis, anthropogenic global warming. Again, keep going. The assumption is that, or the hypothesis is only as good as the assumptions that you make for it. And the next, they assume that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. And as we've already discussed, I'm somewhat cynical about that, certainly cynical about the amount of greenhouse gas that it is. And they assume that a CO2 increase causes a temperature increase. I'll show you a graph in a minute which questions that. Okay, Nick. So what they said, that CO2 will increase because of human industry. So they built into their assumption what will prove what they wanted to prove. So they've said that humans are going to keep producing CO2 and therefore the level of CO2 in the atmosphere will continue to increase no matter what else happens. Ignore any natural variability. They've taken that out of it with this particular assumption. This, of course, is the ice core graph, or Antarctica. I remember when this came out in 1991, and Pettit and Jowsell, and they held a press conference about it, and Jowsell said, hey, don't rush to judgment on this. He said, you know, you got an 8-centimeter graph of 420,000 years. And not only that, but we've smoothed it with a 70-year smoothing average. We've taken all the variability out of it. So you really can't determine much from it. It wasn't but 5 years later that Fisher and others showed that the temperature was changing before the CO2, not as had been assumed in their, that CO2 causes temperature increase. Okay. This is John Christie's presentation to the U.S. Congress, and of course I think Tony already showed this graph. This is the actual balloon and satellite observations, and this is the average of the models. And what happened after the 1990 report, and I remember this being discussed, their predictions were out by 400% in the first 5 years. And so they stopped calling them predictions and started calling them projections and scenarios. And you'll see that moving the goalpost goes on all of the time. Okay, I wanted to show you this particular graph because this shows, and this is part of what Tony showed, the temperature increasing up to about 2000 and then leveling off and declining. Notice that in this portion it's called global warming, after it becomes climate change. Now the reason I know that was because one of the great thrills of my life to be mentioned on the front page of the Times in England, but it was as a climate change denier. Okay, so take credit wherever you can get it.
Tim, before you leave that slide.
Sorry?
Tim, before you leave that slide,
yeah.
1998.
Yes.
Features prominently.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, you'll notice, remember, those who saw me on Q&A with Brian Cox, I pointed out two things. The 1930s in his graph had been reduced in temperature. Tony confirmed that. I also pointed out that 1998 had been eliminated. And that means it produced a complete warming. That's all it was. Cox's graph was a phony complete. They reduced the most prominent temperature in the last 20 years. The last, how many years?
Yeah. Okay, the other thing is, of course, that what caused their problem here was that the temperature started to level off, but CO2 continued to increase, in complete contradiction of their hypothesis. And as Huxley said over 100 years ago, the great tragedy of science is a lovely hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. And this was their ugly fact. But instead of going back and looking at their science and saying the science is wrong, they moved the goalposts. They started calling it climate change instead of global warming. And that was deliberate, because if you click again, you'll see here, this is a 2004 leaked email from the ClimateGate emails, okay, from Minns at the Tyndall Center. He said, in my experience, global warming, freezing is already a bit of a public relations problem, okay? So already the public are starting, because we had a few cold winters, right? And see, where's that global warming you promised us? And of course I had to tell people that global warming was just another undelivered government promise. But then Swedish chief climate negotiator Bo Yellen replied, I agree with Nick that climate change might be a better labeling than global warming. So they knew what was going on. This is all worked out and planned out. Go ahead. Okay, I'll just show you this very quickly because this one for the public is so important. This is the ice cores. This is Ali's plot of the ice cores. Here's the current temperature over here. Here's the little ice age, the medieval warm period. And so you can quite show with this that about 95% of the last 10,000 years has been warmer than today. And that absolutely shocks people to find that. And we talk about empirical evidence because this photograph is from Hubert Lamb's volume 2. It's a Picea glauca. We click the next one. It's a white spruce. It's 100 kilometers north of the current tree line. And for a tree of that dimension to grow at that latitude, and you can see here what I did was I plotted, it's radiocarbon dated at 5,000 years, and there you can see that global temperatures were at least 2 to 3 degrees warmer than at present. And if you know I've done a lot of studies on the trees at the tree line. I mean, you can get a tree right at the tree line today that's about, maybe that size. It's 120 years old. You need a microscope to see the tree ring growth. So this is empirical evidence that the Earth was much warmer in the past. Okay. They built in, this is from Agenda 21, Principle 15. And it is essentially a catch-all. You remember that earlier thing I showed you about they decide when there's a problem, and they decide when you've reached the limits. Well, this is Principle 15. In order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach will be applied by states according to their capabilities. So, of course, that's that socialist idea. Well, we'll make the rich pay and the poor don't have to pay. And where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be required. I don't fess with facts. We'll decide what's appropriate, right? And shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. This, of course, is the precautionary principle built into, in bureaucratic terms, put into the Agenda 21. And it just allows them to do whatever they want. They decide when there's a problem, and it's built there. I mentioned in my earlier comments about the Yale study. This is the grading of public knowledge of climate change, and you can see here that 77% failed the test. And it was really, the results are quite shocking. But it's why, of course, that the public simply say, I don't understand it, so I'm not worried about it. Okay, this is the most important quote. I put it on the back of both my books now. This is Klaus Eckhart Pulse, and he says, 10 years ago, I simply parroted what the IPCC told us. One day, I started checking the facts and data. First, I started with a sense of doubt, but then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense, was not even supported by any scientific facts and measurements. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist, I made presentations of their science without first checking it. And of course, that speaks to the fact that when they say, well, there's 97% of scientists agree. No, 97% of scientists have never even looked at their science reports. Because the minute they look at them, they're stunned. And Tony mentioned Harrison Schmitt. I happen to be lucky enough to be invited to speak to his breakfast table in Washington when he started looking at this stuff, and he had a whole group of engineers around the table. They could not believe what they were hearing and seeing with regard to this climate science. Okay, this is my hero, Václav Klaus, Czech Republic leader, the only world leader that spoke out. He spoke at the first Heartland Conference on Climate in New York, and his opening comment was, we've just gone through 70 years of communism. Why the hell would you want to go back to that? The room erupted. The room absolutely erupted. And of course, he wrote a actually difficult to get a hold of book now, and it speaks to Malcolm's point, Blue Planet in Green Shackles. I love that title. And of course, notice, what is endangered? Climate or freedom? And I think Viv would speak to that. Okay. I'll just finish up with my own advertising. This is the first book I brought out, The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science. I held off on it for 20 years because I knew the public were not ready. And even now, a lot of the public find it a hard slog. But I had to have it with enough footnotes and details to deflect a lot of the academic criticism, because that's where the worst attacks come from. It's the people, the academic world. This is the one I just brought out. It's about 100 pages, nice pocket edition, and hopefully will help people as they start to listen to what Tony's saying and what Malcolm is doing. Human-caused global warming, the biggest deception in history. And I've done it in a journalistic way, the who, what, where, why, how, and when this thing was achieved, and that's basically what I've summarized for you here. Thank you very much for your attention.